Hello friends. So this is a slightly more casual video than my typical essay style dungeon videos and things like that, but I gotta talk about this Tears of the Kingdom trailer before my brain explodes. So, that trailer, huh? I'm actually a little flabbergasted that there are people online saying it didn't show enough or that it looks the same as Breath of the Wild when just about every frame is packed with new details. Like, pause at any point in that trailer and you'll see something new. Even the things that are carried over from Breath of the Wild seem to be at least altered in some way, so it's a bit confusing to me. One thing that stands out to me personally was just how much of this trailer seems to be taking place in brand new areas, and it got my brain going. I know many people think of me as sort of the dungeon guy when it comes to Zelda, so it seems fitting that this be the topic of the video. Did this trailer actually just show us dungeons? Or am I grasping? Well, maybe a bit of both. There is a chance that traditional dungeons, as much as I love them, are retired, but that doesn't mean we'll have no gameplay scenarios that fit that role. There's a chance that some areas will essentially be stand-ins for the dungeons of old. But first, something to clarify and get our brains going. What are dungeons? What actually counts? It's one of those things that we all just know when it's a dungeon, typically, but can we really put our fingers on what defines it? There's been some debate over the subject ever since Breath of the Wild's release, and I have my stance on the matter, but let's go over a few points first. The most famous dungeons of the series tend to be elemental-themed temples, and that makes sense. They're diverse and visually distinct from each other, and therefore memorable. Ocarina of Time probably has the most well-known examples. You've got the Forest Temple, Fire Temple, Water Temple, etc. But dungeons go back further than that. Ocarina of Time is the 5th game in the series after all, and before that, the dungeons weren't always so strictly tied to a specific theme. And yet, nobody's arguing if the dungeons of Zelda 1 and 2 count, right? But they're lacking in a lot of the staples that we've come to expect from a dungeon. So how do we discern what is and isn't a dungeon? Do we have a checklist of tropes that the game must adhere to? I mean, I can certainly see that being the case. I think if you asked most people, they would say that the checklist is as follows. To be a dungeon, you must have a self-contained area containing a new item, a map, compass, keys and locked doors, a boss key, and then a boss fight at the end that rewards you with a heart container. And yeah, that all makes sense. You describe that, it sounds exactly like a typical Zelda dungeon. Makes sense. Until you start looking at how different Zelda games handle their dungeons. The first 3 dungeons of Ocarina of Time have no keys or locked doors whatsoever. There's no boss key or small keys, but they still count, right? Skyward Sword has no compass, Zelda 2 has no map or compass, nor does it reward us with a heart container at the end. Zelda 1 has dungeon items, but only one dungeon that actually uses it for any progression within the dungeon itself. The waters get muddied even further when mini-dungeons come into play. Do we count the ice cavern? There's no heart container at the end, but we get a map, a compass, and an item. Majora's Mask and Skyward Sword both sprinkle important items around the overworld, being the rewards for overcoming some gameplay scenarios such as the Pirate's Fortress or the Silent Realm, for example. So is it the gameplay structure that makes it a dungeon? Well, maybe not, because those vary just as often as well. Some dungeons feel like big open explorable areas or labyrinths with branching paths and tons of freedom. Some feel like a linear sequence of rooms with individual puzzles, and some feel like one interconnected larger puzzle to unravel. And Breath of the Wild most controversially has shrines and divine beasts. I've always said that shrines, to me, feel more like they fill the role of the side content found in previous games. I mean, think about it this way. Previous games have optional challenges and side quests that tend to reward us with a heart piece at the end. In Breath of the Wild, we get shrines which are optional challenges, sometimes with side quests that reward us with a spirit orb at the end. And the spirit orbs are basically just this game's stand-in for heart pieces, and they just happen to double as fast travel points. So, in my view, the Divine Beasts and Hyrule Castle fill that dungeon role. If we think of the champion abilities as stand-ins for dungeon items, then it makes more sense. An isolated area with a map, puzzles, combat scenarios, a boss fight at the end that gives us a heart container, that's all here within the Divine Beasts. But then by the same token, the final trial with Monk Maz Koshia does not give us a heart container at the end, despite being structured so similarly to the Divine Beasts, even having a boss fight at the end. In fact, my favorite boss fight in the game. Nor does Hyrule Castle, which is structured so differently from the rest. So what counts? Is it a boss fight that makes it a dungeon then? Well, then we have to account for overworld bosses. The series is no stranger to having boss battles out and about in the overworld, but I don't think anybody is arguing that the Great Sea or Hyrule Field are dungeons. A comment I got on a video once was someone saying that the Divine Beasts did not count as dungeons because they were simply some rooms with enemies and puzzles and then a boss fight at the end. But all I could think of reading that was that that's pretty much what dungeons are, aren't they? A series of rooms with puzzles, sometimes combat scenarios, and a boss at the end. But then again, some dungeons take place in exterior areas like the City in the Sky or the Palace of Winds, which both have a healthy balance of inside and outdoor sections. Now, I don't mean to be so eclectic with my thoughts here, but I think it's important to realize that Zelda as a series has for many years played it fast and loose with its gameplay structures. We often think of a Zelda formula being a thing, but the truth is that Zelda constantly shakes that formula up. And Breath of the Wild was in many ways a gameplay renaissance for the series. Tears of the Kingdom seems to be following the trend set up there. But I also know that the Zelda team does listen to fan feedback, and Breath of the Wild's openness, for example, was a direct response to criticism that Skyward Sword was too linear. So with dungeons being the most requested feature for Breath of the Wild, I have to believe that they'll return in some shape or form. It just may not be as immediately recognizable to us as the dungeons of old. But let's come back to the trailer itself, to Tears of the Kingdom. That trailer is packed with details, but we see multiple shots of Link and various enemies in what appears to be cave systems. We can see stalactites in the background of this shot with these Lizalfos mining some kind of ore, and there is this shot of Link evading a Hinox within this tunnel. Breath of the Wild simply did not have underground caves of this caliber, aside from the shrines perhaps, so it seems likely to me that these sorts of caves could act as dungeons. And before anybody says that caves can't count as dungeons, they have to be temples or something, there are plenty of cave areas that have been dungeons before. Dragon Roost Cavern, Tail Cave, Dodongo's Cavern, heck, even the Fire Temple from Ocarina of Time has some cave-like areas that were lacking in architectural flair. These sorts of areas would be perfect for dungeons. The overworld is large and open, but caves can be closed off, can have branching paths and barriers to prevent progress unless certain conditions are met. And most importantly, they can have danger lurking around every corner. But my favorite Zelda games are the ones in which dungeons aren't just one thing. Diversity is good, so let's shift gears and look at basically the opposite thing. The sky. The Sky Islands of Tears of the Kingdom also present a great opportunity for new dungeons. We see some islands have bridges connecting them to each other, and some seem to even have massive buildings. I don't see why these buildings couldn't be dungeons, or even the islands themselves. A lot of these Sky Islands seem like they're grouped together in clusters, and then the clusters are spread out. And it brings to mind for me places like the Palace of Winds and the City in the Sky, both great dungeons that had you crisscrossing around a series of floating islands. These could both be great examples for Tears of the Kingdom to follow when modeling its dungeons. A cluster of Sky Islands could have some puzzles that impact each other, and then a reward and or boss fight at the end of it. Some could be a mix of interior and exterior. We see this island with this massive sphere, which could be some kind of large building or dome. And this particular building I just can't get out of my head. This sort of massive tower. Who knows how much they could fit inside of it, especially if there's a loading zone between the door and the exterior. Having caves and these sky islands act as dungeons would allow the developers to modulate our progress and the dungeon difficulty by crafting gameplay scenarios that are separate from the overworld, which should stay entirely open. The sky islands feel open, but they can segment these areas to limit our access. Or heck, they could just have it made in such a way that we're not limited. I mean, Hyrule Castle in Breath of the Wild is a great realization of how dungeons could work in the new open-air gameplay style. I actually have a video on that very thing featuring the lovely Triforce trends, by the way, so go check that out if you have the time. So they could even model it that way after Hyrule Castle, having these isolated areas that are essentially big open playgrounds for us to explore. Like Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom as a larger whole, then the player can choose how much of the content they do or do not want to interact with. And dividing these dungeons up between caves and islands in the sky also present the opportunity for more diverse gameplay scenarios. I think the biggest issue that Breath of the Wild had with its shrines and divine beasts was that it just started to feel redundant. It was just lacking in diversity. So having different sections with different kinds of dungeons just makes the gameplay more fresh. Now naturally, this is all speculative, and I could be wrong about all of this stuff, but I love dungeons, and while Breath of the Wild was somewhat of a letdown in that department, it got so much else right outside of those dungeons, so much so that even though dungeons are one of my favorite parts of the series, Breath of the Wild still ended up being my favorite game of all time. So if they can integrate those ideas into Tears of the Kingdom, then the potential for how good this game can be is off the charts. I'll have some more dungeon videos and hopefully more Tears of the Kingdom content for you guys all soon. So stay tuned, and I'd like to open the conversation up to you guys now. Please comment down below and let me know your thoughts, your dreams, your wishes, all of that stuff, because this game is only 3 months away and we actually still don't technically have dungeon confirmation. It's all speculation at this point, but I'd like to think that we've seen some hints towards it, and there's a lot of potential here. So please let me know what you guys thought of this, and also let me know what you think of this format. This is a slightly different sort of video than I usually do, so if you liked it, let me know. If not, also please let me know, because I like the feedback and I want to make content that you guys enjoy. Thank you all so much for watching, and remember to hype responsibly. Thank you so much for watching this video. Before we end this off, I just wanted to take a moment to say thank you to my patrons and channel members, including but not limited to Greymage, Brenda, Tetra, Callie, Gail, Hylian Wes, Justin, Clifford Longhead, Midnight Naomi, and Bunny. Thank you all so much for the support and for watching, and I will catch you all next time. Bye bye!